Okay, so just an overview of what we're going to be looking at. We're going to be looking at the historical relationship between yoga and early Buddhism, the core philosophical ideas of liberation, what that means to a Buddhist, and what that means to a yogi. We're also going to be looking at practices taught by the Buddha that lead to realization, and what are the practices taught in the Yoga Sūtras. And as well, how the Buddhist and yogic practices interrelated. So first, and very briefly, we're just going to look at this. Now, I'm sorry if you can't see it, but this is from Jim Mallinson's, the name has just left me. Massive. Sorry?
Is it from Roots of Yoga?
Roots of Yoga, yes, thank you. I just had a brain freeze then. So this is an important timeline of texts. We're obviously not going to be looking at all of this. It's too vast. And of course, there are loads that are missing from this timeline. It's a really good book. I highly recommend having a good look at it. But what we are going to be looking at are this first page really here. We're going to be looking at yoga, how it's developed, the Satipatthana Sutta, that's a Buddhist text, that's going to be really important. Buddhism and yoga interlace throughout this entire timeline. When, after the Vedas, when ritual really starts to set in, we have the Shramana movement. When the Upanishads really start to develop, we have people breaking away from the central ritual, the fire rituals. And so we start to have a development of yogis, of wandering aesthetics that leave the main town, leave the main focus of the central fire, and they start to explore yoga on their own. So that's when we really get the development of the Upanishads. So they become a really important influence to yoga. So we're really going to look at the work of the Upanishads between the 800 and 200 BCE. Okay, so this is where we start to see early yoga really start to manifest. So not so much asana, but the different aspects of meditation, absorption, and what it is, what liberation actually is. So the difference, we could say, is that the Upanishads talk about the corruption of the priest. They talk about because the Vedic fire rituals start to set in, because they become established and almost institutionalized by this point, by the time of the Chandogya Upanishad, we start to have the Shramana movement. They're moving away from this, and they're starting to really try and find true liberation, true freedom. So there is a discrepancy. Now, around the 4th century BCE, we have the Buddha. So this is really an urban tradition. So the contrast would be the Buddha is trying to assimilate Dharma into an urban environment. The Buddha really relies on the town for support, to support the Sangha. So the difference, I suppose you could say, is that the Buddha is very careful about how he relays Dharma so that it can be integrated into a Brahmanical society. The Upanishads, the later Upanishads, are quite sort of radical, if you like. They're moving away. They're not trying to appease necessarily a Brahmanical structure. They're almost rebelling against this institutionalization of the Vedic system. Of the Yajurveda. This is when the Vedic system no longer is a kind of tribal community. It's more like an established, ritualized procedure. So this really does kind of set the scene for the Buddha. Yoga already exists. And there's a lot of practices already within of samadhi and dhyana and pratyahara that already exist. They've already been talked about, they've already been practiced, and they're mastered to quite a level. Okay, so we're just going to focus on this part, these texts. Later on, as yoga develops into Buddhism, we start to see an interrelationship and integration of hatha yoga, asana practices with Buddhism in the Vajrayana practices. Now, that's not so much in early Buddhism. We only see that later. The relationship or the thread that links yoga asana, or the more esoteric types of practices controlling bindu in Tantra, in Buddhism, are through Shaiva Tantra. And so we don't have Shaiva Tantra yet. We don't have any forms of Tantra. We have Proto-Samkhya, which is, I'll go into what Samkhya is throughout the talk. What we're going to do here is we're going to compare Dharma theory with Samkhya. I'm going to talk about Buddhist Dharma theory first, and then I'm going to talk about Samkhya philosophy, and we're going to compare the two. After that, I'll talk about Buddhist practice. So what is the path to liberation? And then I'm going to talk about the Yoga Sūtras. What is their path to liberation? And then compare the two. So starting off, let's look at what liberation is to a Buddhist, to an early Buddhist. So we're looking at complete cessation of craving and aversion, absolute ending of craving and aversion. So that would be one aspect of liberation. That completely finishes, that ceases. Also, directly seeing and experiencing the nature of reality. So having real insight. Insight is in psychic awareness, not just a kind of a subtle intuition. It's a real direct seeing. That's when you become a stream enterer, and the path then on towards an arhat. So you need to have the direct witness of this. And this is a very deep, very profound experience. So this is what we're trying to get to this witnessing. And through that, you start to see the Four Noble Truths. So to see the Four Noble Truths, really see it, means that you break that bond of rebirth. And I'll explain, I'll go into this, I'll unpack this in detail. So this is really radical freedom. We are ending suffering. We're removing the hindrances, and all you're left with is joy, friendliness, fearlessness. So we typically, and this spans across most Indian traditions, we are ending the cycle of rebirth. So we can assume that the concept of reincarnation exists in Vedanta, in Buddhism, in yoga. So this is a very common thread. So people just take this concept for granted in India, this concept of reincarnation. So the Buddha already has this idea. However, what he adds to this idea is how it works. Okay, so now before Gautama becomes a Buddha, he's a yogi. So there's two really important characters in the early suttas. We can see this in the Majjhima Nikaya, the Nikayas are the Buddhist, when we talk about early Buddhism, we're referring to the Pitakas, the three baskets, and these are loads, it's huge, loads of scriptures, the three baskets. The first basket is the Vinayas, that's the code of conduct for monks. And the second book would be the suttas that the Buddha was teaching about. So this would be practice. The path to awakening. This was for the monks, this was for the laity, this was for everyone. And then the last set of books is the Abhidhamma. So the Abhidhamma isn't a disclosure from the Buddha, it's a disclosure from the arhats that came afterwards. The Abhidhamma is a set of books. It's very important because it opens up Mahayana Buddhism. It opens up all the concepts of non-duality later on. Okay, so we're going to talk about Abhidhamma in a little bit more detail. So back to Alara Kalama and Uddaka Ramaputra. These are two yogis that the Buddha Gautama, not a Buddha yet, comes or meets. And he learns a very, very deep state of samadhi, a state of no perception, neither perception nor non-perception. So this state of samadhi is where there's no self anymore, where there's no awareness of the self or awareness of anything else. It's complete cessation. It's a type of cessation. It's a yogic cessation. Now, this is a really important difference from Buddhism and yoga, is that the Buddha achieved this state quite easily, having practiced so many austerities, very intense austerities in his when he left his life and started to practice yoga. But what he found was when he came out of this state of samadhi, the mind continued to work, suffering continued. There was still craving, there was still aversion. So it was only in this state that he was free from suffering. Now, so this yogic path, the idea is to yoke yourself to a purusha. We're going to talk about what purusha is and what yoking is. And this concept allows one to be free forever. So, and we're going to discuss that in a little bit more detail in what Kaivalya is later on in Samkhya. But for now, we're going to focus on Buddhism and what the Buddha thought freedom was. So he denied this kind of, he denied this samadhi as absolute freedom. He wanted to find a complete cessation of craving and aversion, not just in a state of samadhi, but all the time, permanently. Okay, so he wanted freedom just in a normal state, or, well, we'll discuss what that actually means as well. And so in order to explain really what this insight is, or how do we get there, I think it's really important to understand Buddhist metaphysics, or how the mind works. And that way we can really look at what are the practices, and how do the practices support this insight into the nature of reality. Okay, so the Abhidhamma, the third basket, we're going to look at dharmas. Okay, so this is Buddhist metaphysics. It's extraordinary actually, the way these insights. And so I recently did a study researching long-term Buddhist meditators on the path and looking at their insights, especially in Vipassana. And it was really extraordinary to find out some of these people had direct seeing of the nature of these dharmas. And I'm going to talk to you about the nature of these dharmas now. Okay, so dharmas, they are a kind of physical and mental substance. Okay, so they're composed of the same substance. They're tiny building blocks that they arise and they pass away multiple times a second, we refer to this as chittavritti. Okay, so these dharmas are tiny, as you can see from this Buddha head here. We perceive a head, however, if you look closer, they're tiny, 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 tiny little Buddhas. Now, the misidentification with these tiny dharmas and arising and passing away is what the Buddhists call ignorance. Ignorance isn't lack of intellectual knowledge, it's misunderstanding. Okay, so suffering comes from this misunderstanding. When we identify with a solid form, this illusory reality, we start to suffer. The mind processes begin, dependent origination begins. We'll discuss in more detail what that is. So these dharmas, now, according to meditators, this is the experience of these dharmas up close and personal, like little bubbles arising and passing away multiple times a second. People describe a kind of foam. The body turns into that, and you can feel them coming up and popping, arising and popping, coming from nothing and popping into nothing. This is when you start to get into the building blocks. Okay, so just a quick look at what suffering is to a Buddhist. So dukkha, the prefix du means bad, and ka is a later Sanskrit word which means sky, space, or hole. So in early Vedic times, that would refer to the wheel of a cart, the hole in the wheel of a cart. Now, if this was off center, the cart wouldn't run on its tracks. So it was uncomfortable. It was an unsatisfactory ride. Okay, so this is what dukkha is referring to. So it's not necessarily, life is suffering. That word doesn't necessarily conjure up the correct kind of notion that it would to a Buddhist. It means no synchronicity. It means that the flow isn't there, harmony in life. Okay. So when we can't see the nature of reality, we get stuck. We become attached to the craving and aversion. This is the nature of the mind. Okay, so these dharmas, where do they arise from and where do they come from? So early Buddhism refers to this as bhavanga. Later Buddhism refers to this as alaya vijnana. So bhavanga is like a primordial state of nothing, okay? And these dharmas arise like seeds. and they pass away. So they arise to the surface, and when they arise to the surface, we call that an experience. It's a phenomena. So dharmas, remember, they are everything physical, everything emotional, everything mental. Okay, so they arise and they pass away multiple times a second. Now, bhavanga is the closest thing a Buddhist will have to a soul. And remember, in Buddhism, there is no soul. There is no such thing as Atman. There is no such thing as soul. Bhavanga, this state of nothing. This is where the storehouse of karma resides. All of these seeds or dharmas sit dormant in bhavanga, waiting to arise and pass away, arise and pass away. Now, these dharmas behave in a very particular way, okay? So each dharma that arises and passes away affects the next dharma, okay? So it has each dharma has a particular characteristic as well, and it sort of perfumes, or it gives off or attracts or magnetizes another dharma to arise. This is what the Buddhists call causality. Okay, so when a dharma arises, a particular type of dharma, it will attract another one. So when we think a certain thing, that will kind of invite a particular dharma to that thought to arise. This is a magnetism almost that draws all of these dharmas up. And so this is related to Patana. This is the book in the Abhidhamma. Patana describes this, and this talks about, this is related to Satipatthana as a practice, and we will talk about the Satipatthana in a little bit more detail. So now an interesting interview I had with someone when they described what these dharmas were like, it was they said, okay, so just as to quote, I think atomic is a good interpretation. I felt that I was in the building blocks. This is in a Vipassana retreat, because everything was changing constantly in the body, constantly arising, constantly changing over the whole body, just tiny little bubbles, little bits, very tiny sensations and feelings. There's something magnetic about them, polarizing and depolarizing. Now, this is when we break these dharmas down. So these dharmas arise in heaps together. So these dharmas could constitute a particular thought, a particular feeling. These dharmas can also arise as a physical thing, so the ear or the eye. And together these dharmas arise and they act as a mechanism. So the consciousness of seeing, the consciousness of hearing. Now remember, these are just tiny dharmas arising and passing away. They aren't real. They're just coming into existence and falling away out of existence. So there is no solid reality. It's just this arising and passing. So the very basic fundamental dharmas are called the Mahabhutas. Now, these Mahabhutas exist in every bundle of dharmas that arise, and these Mahabhutas give realness to our experience. So these Mahabhutas would be the fire element, the air element, earth element, water element, and space element. So every time, so for instance, when you touch something solid, you are experiencing a heap of dharmas that arise, which would be all the sensations that you're experiencing, as well as earth dharmas. So that gives you the experience of something solid, the same with something liquid. When you drink water, the feeling of liquid is because the water dharmas are arising in that heap. Okay, so these are the fundamental particles. This is what gives us the illusion of the three-dimensional reality that we live in. Now, this is very important, and this is the key to the way out of this illusion. Now, remember, every dharma has every heap of dharmas has these mahabhutas. So every heap, including thoughts, emotions, and feelings. So this is a really important key point. So we experience on a very subtle level thoughts, feelings, and emotions in the physical body. Okay, so when we meditate for long enough, when we're mindful, you will experience these mahabhutas as a feeling, a sensation in the body. So this is the connection between thought and body, mind and body for a Buddhist. Okay, so when we just as an example. Okay, so here's just an image of when the Dharmas enter the sense door, and so the sound, a heap of Dharmas, which would constitute as a sound, when they enter through the ear, we create thoughts, we create more Dharmas. This is the process, this is dependent origination. What's happening here, as soon as this interaction happens, we create, the mind will naturally decide whether that's a nice experience or an unpleasant experience or a neutral experience. And then from there, we become to identify with the whole experiencing itself. This is where we become ignorant, this is where we become lost, and this is where we fall into suffering further. So this is all in the Mahāhatipādoppamma Sutta. Okay, so this heap or arising and passing away of dharmas, it follows a certain pattern. That's why some patterns of arising and passing dharmas are a little bit more ingrained, have a little bit more substance to them, like the physical body or anything physical. Certain thoughts or patterns that repeat themselves might have a little bit, more a deeper pattern, a deeper ingrained pattern of arising and passing away. As they continue to arise and pass away, as we identify with them, we make them more real, and therefore they draw that same pattern of arising and passing again and again. So this experience, this relationship between the interaction between sound and hearing, this is what creates thought, and this is what colors the mind. So the question is in Buddhism, and this is really important, is do these dharmas actually exist or not? So the early Buddhism, we just really focus on practice, on the path. We don't really go into the metaphysics so much, or the Buddha didn't. He was just like, he didn't want to talk about metaphysics. He just wanted to talk about the path, the way out. And he wanted everyone just to get on with it and practice. Mahayana later really does go into the existence of dharmas. Is it real? Is it not real? And this is where we start to, through our meditation experience, once you attain a certain level of deep insight, the realness of these dharmas starts to disintegrate, and there really is no thing that tathagata, thus gone. There is no more dharmas, and that is the illusion has burst, cessation has finished. So this is the transformative experience. When you reside or when you experience these arising and passing dharmas long enough to really understand the nature of the mind, the nature of the interaction between the sensory experience and the world outside, this changes you. You no longer become attached to this arising and passing. So you see the three characteristics. The three characteristics in Buddhism are very important. This is that existence is impermanent. You know this now, having seen the dharmas arise and pass away. And the result of the rising and passing away is because of suffering, because of the natural propensity of the mind to crave and have an aversion to whatever it experiences. The third characteristic is no self. There is no self. There is nothing other than arising and passing dharmas. So this realization really does change the psychology. You don't have to engage in the 12, the dependent origination, the causality of the mind anymore. So now, how does this work? So the senses disturb bhavanga. This is one way. Well, there's a few theories about this. The senses are quite hungry all the time. They have a probing nature. Okay, so there's a few scholars, they have different ideas about how this works. Strzelecki, he's a important Buddhist scholar. He says that the senses have a grasping natures to the Mahabhuta. They want to grab at any sensory experience and feed on it or experience this. This is the nature of the senses. Goenka suggests that the senses require food. They want to feed on sensory experience because they're hungry. And Cousins would argue, another important Buddhist scholar, that the senses probe bhavanga. And as soon as bhavanga is disturbed, remember the primordial essence of nothingness or nothingness or where the seeds of dharmas exist. When bhavanga is disturbed, these dharmas arise to the surface, and for the senses to experience. So the senses are always looking, they're always hungry. And depending on the previous dharmas that exist, we create a whole new heap of dharmas that arise, and they can be wholesome or unwholesome. Okay. Now, the Buddhist path isn't about nullifying pleasure or pain or anything like that. It's removing the craving and aversion. So when you release the heart, this craving and aversion relaxes, and you can start to see the nature of reality. So it's the contraction of thought, the grasping. So the example of the two webs, the funnel web, it's very tight and grasping. This grasping nature creates very unwholesome dharmas. So in Buddhism, we refer to wholesome or unwholesome. So this very tight sensation causes pain in the body. A wholesome dharma is very light, very open, very lifted. And this is a pleasant sensation in the body. So this experience is what brings us to nama rupa. Nama rupa, name and form. Nama, name, rupa, form. Okay, the form is in the body. Name and form. This is the interrelatedness of a thought and emotion and the body. Okay, so nama is the mental processes of a person, and rupa is the physical form. This is why the experience of thinking and thoughts affects the body. Now, here are the wholesome and unwholesome types of thoughts that exist. Okay, so unwholesome would be unpleasant sensation, individuality, doubt, anything that clings to a notion of self. So aversion, desire of form, desire for the formless, pride, agitation. So all of these unwholesome thoughts, they originate from craving and aversion. The wholesome thoughts, friendliness, generosity, patience, energy, insight, honesty, contentment, goodwill, equanimity. These all arise from letting go, a release of the heart. There's not much craving and aversion in these dharmas that arise, in these thoughts and feelings that arise. Okay, so this is really important. We want to cultivate wholesome dharmas as a foundation before practice. Okay, so that was a real whistle-stop tour of Dharma theory in Buddhism. We're going to move on to what is liberation or Samkhya philosophy, guna theory in Pātañjalayogaśāstra. Is everyone okay so far? We can write down questions, and then we can go over certain details later on. Okay, so Pātañjalayogaśāstra. Now, Buddhism was about non-duality, nothing exists. Now we're going to go over to Samkhya Yoga. So this is different. Purusha and Prakriti. Purusha is non-material, it's consciousness, it's separate to materiality. It's watches the play of materiality unfold. So Prakriti is all manifest material reality. So that can be a thought and an emotion and flesh and blood and all physical objects. But Prakriti is matter. So even to Samkhya, in Samkhya philosophy, a thought and emotion consists of a kind of matter. Purusha isn't matter, it's just pure consciousness. These two things exist separately. This is a dual philosophy. Okay, these are separate. Later, Tantra merges these principles together into a non-dual idea, but that's another thing. So Purusha, Prakriti, separate things. Okay, so Prakriti is without Purusha, it's dormant. It doesn't do anything. It just lays there, mudra prakriti, just waiting to happen. Nothing happens until Purusha, or until it engages with Purusha. So it's kind of a witness, I suppose. It gives energy to consciousness. It gives purpose. It has a kind of movement. It performs only for Purusha. Nothing else. It only performs for this witnessing consciousness. It doesn't move unless Purusha is watching it. It doesn't exist unless Purusha is watching it. It doesn't activate unless consciousness is watching it. Now, whether or not consciousness watches, that's a whole debate that we won't go into, or the real subtle interaction between Purusha and Prakriti. That's a huge kind of discussion in itself. Now, okay, so Prakriti, they consist of the gunas, the three gunas, sattva, rajas, tamas. I'm sorry if this is like, you've heard this lots and lots before, but I think it's really important and interesting to compare the two Buddhist and yogic philosophies. So the sattva, rajas, tamas, these are the gunas. This is Prakriti. Sattva, rajas, tamas is matter, different qualities to manifesting matter. Okay, so sattva, it holds form. It's like sattva is a force, if you like. It has the ability to reveal an object, their true form. It's a lightness, structure. It is happiness, bliss. Rajas is like energy, fire. It's movement, desire. It can be the cause of pain and sorrow in the human experience, but we're talking about a force that governs the whole universe here. So this is not necessarily just through human experience. This is an energy that brings action into Prakriti. Tamas, it solidifies, it makes things solid, neutral. It also makes things impotent if there's too much tamas, or passive. It can also, in the human experience, too much tamasic energy can make one very heavy, sad, depressed, so on and so forth. Now, all of nature is made from this interaction between the gunas. So whatever balance of gunas there are will create whatever nature is out there, or whatever experience we have, or that exists at all in the entire cosmos. So remember, mental and physical as well. The gunas make up what is mental and what is physical. Okay, so we're going to look at this scary chart, but it's okay. Don't worry, we're going to kind of gently go away through it. So Purusha, Prakriti, the two fundamental components. Now, in the very beginning, sattva starts at his overall, or notices Purusha notices sattva, and then Buddhi emerges. This is Mahat. This is the beginning, the very first principle to exist. It's very sattvic, very light. And then this creates a kind of, again, the disturbance in the gunas starts to create a hamkara, like an ego, an identity. So this is sattva and rajas coming into play together. And ahamkara is this identity with this, a self starts to form, a consciousness of singularity begins to form. Now the interplay between sattvic and tamasic starts to create different components, such as sounds, smells, objects of appearance. Also, the sattvic element combined with the rajasic guna starts to create cognitive senses, and the instruments of this, so your ear, the eye, the mouth, the taste, the touch, all of these things. I've made a little, I don't know if this makes it any easier to understand. So the gunas come together in interplay, and they create these different sensory experiences. These are very subtle. They don't have physical form yet. However, more tamas gets involved, and they start to turn into elemental form, material, our experience of what three-dimensional material is. This is the influence of tamas and rajas. Okay, so, I mean, that's just a brief explanation of how physical manifest reality comes into being. This is very important because it's like an unfolding that happens. And yoga is the opposite to that. So when these gunas are constantly moving, constantly flowing, they flow through our instruments of sight, speech, touch. And depending on the quality of the gunas, that will imprint on the object that we see. So for instance, if we're looking at a tree, and our eyesight is influenced by a lot of tamasic guna, you might notice it dying. You might notice the less pleasant bits in it. You might be sad by what you see. If you have a very sattvic guna moving through your eyesight, you'll see something more structure. You'll see the tree in more of its wholeness, in more of its life, in more of its fruit, in more of its abundant growing, or even down to its detail, down to understand how the tree grows, understand how life moves through it. So sattva is very important. It's clarity. You can see through. It has this sort of lightness to it, which allows clear seeing. So the interaction between sound, between the listening faculties, the sensory faculties, creates thoughts and patterns of behavior. These are called samskaras. Okay, so the interaction between these things, this gets the mind moving. This continually makes all of these gunas move and move through the body. So a thought's created, the gunas affect that thought, and then another thought is created. So we're projecting continually on top of each other. So SK is Samkhya Karika. These are the verses which describe this particular action or process in more detail. Samkhya Karika is a text which kind of explains the relationship between Purusha and Prakriti, and the nature of Purusha and liberation. So we are Prakriti. Our tendency is to be attracted to the dividing nature of things. This is what our mind does. It's constantly creating more thought, more action. It's because the gunas don't stop. They just keep going. They keep flowing through us, and they keep making samskaras. They will not stop until we start practicing yoga. Okay, so we become very attached to the material plane because the gunas they just keep going. This is in the Yoga Sūtras, the second pada, verse 9. Now, what happens is this interchange, it causes, after a while, it becomes very tamasic in nature because they're just layering and laying samskara and samskara upon top of each other. It will become heavy with this illusory projection, and we suffer. Okay, so we are bound to a lower plane of existence because of this. The tamasic mind, so the more samskaras build up, we become more and more tamasic. We have a false identification of the self. We identify with this suffering because it's so heavy. We can't see clearly anymore. And this is what binds us to rebirth. This is what makes us born again. So this is very similar to Buddhism, the concept of ignorance, the concept of suffering. This is where the key components interrelate. And this is Samkhya Karika, verse 55 and 62 describe this. Okay, so this is the fundamental components which where we can, these concepts, although guna theory and dharma theory, they might be different, you can join them. Later Vajrayana Buddhism does. So this is how Tantra and Dharma theory come together. And there are aspects of those two things. It's the tamasic nature, it's the building up of samskaras, it's the nature of the mind, this continuous activity of the mind. So this is where the two are very similar. Now, if we are to continue to identify with this process, we become ignorant and attached. Our ego develops. We become more afraid of dying. And so these are the kleshas. These are the things that bind us to suffering. So when we are ignorant, we keep building up more and more samskaras. If we can't see what's happening, then we continue to create more identification with this suffering. So this is our human experience. And the gunas, Prakriti, will continue this dance for Purusha, just for Purusha. This is what Prakriti is. This is nature doing this for Purusha to watch. It's a very beautiful relationship. It's a romantic relationship, if you like, and this is where later Tantra, Shiva and Shakti, this is their whole interplay. And so Samkhya is very much, this is the nature. This is how the human mind dances. So we can equate this tamasic mind, this sattvic mind, to wholesome and unwholesome dharmas, much like in Buddhism. So, so again, identifying with that process of the dharmas arising and passing away creates suffering. Okay, so liberation in Samkhya is the reverse process of this unfoldingness of nature, right? So everything, what we want to do is isolate the senses enough so that everything can fold back into itself. It emerges back into ahamkara, then buddhi, then mura prakriti, and then you're just left with kaivalya all on its own. This is laya yoga, the dissolution of each principle into the other, back to its original source. And this is, you're left with purusha, kaivalya, the aloneness of purusha. No more gunas, no more prakriti, nothing's happening, nothing exists. It's just consciousness. So this is kaivalya, this is final liberation. It's aloneness. So this is the end of part one. This is all the philosophy. I hope that wasn't too much. We'll talk about practice now. It's quite a lot. I don't know how we're doing for time. I'll just check. Oh, okay, right. We'll skim through this as quick as possible. Okay, so we're going to look at first the Buddhist path of practice. Okay, so the truth of the path to cessation of suffering. The truth of the path to cessation of suffering. Okay, one of the Four Noble Truths. Now, there are two paths. So we're in Buddhism now. We've looked at the philosophy of Buddhism, Dharma theory, and Samkhya Guna theory. Now we're going to look at the Buddhist path of practice. Okay, so there is a way out of suffering. There is a way to stop the dharmas from arising and passing away. And this is through two paths, samatha, vipassana. Initially, they might feel like two very different types of meditation practice. After a while, they merge and become one. Okay, so we need to practice samatha in order to get the insight. Samatha is calm concentration. You need to polish your mind so it's like a razor blade, so you can penetrate the nature of reality and see things as they really are. And then you see the dharmas, your psychology is changed permanently and you suffer no more. So we're going to talk about that in more detail. Okay, so both concentration, samatha, and insight, they generate happiness, they generate a mind free from hindrances. However, the mechanisms are different, right? So one is born, so samatha, concentration, is born from seclusion. So you're willfully stopping the hindrances. Mindfulness, you're allowing them to arise, but you're remaining equanimous. So you're watching them arise and you're remaining equanimous to what's happening. We're going to talk about samatha first. Okay, so this is Mahasachaka Sutta in the Majjhima Nikayas. So this sutta talks about the Buddha's awakening under the Bodhi tree, and this is where he really goes into the samatha meditation. It's called calm abiding, concentration, samadhi, jhana. Now, I would have a discrepancy over the name samadhi, but that's because of the jhana factors, which we'll talk about in a minute. Now, okay, so before the Buddha becomes enlightened, before he sees the nature of the dharmas, he's practicing samatha meditation. Now, what's there is a sutta in the Nikayas which talk about the Buddha when he was a young lad, watching his farmer till the fields, tow the fields, and he's goes into this deep state of samadhi, just spontaneously. A jhana. I'll talk about what a jhana is in more detail. And he realizes this is the way, this is the path to enlightenment. This is it. And then later grows up to become a Buddha. So first of all, access concentration. Okay, so before we get anywhere, we need to get to access concentration. This is a Buddhist type of concentration experience. And it's born from vitāka vichara. So vitāka is when you apply your thought to one point. So you're putting your attention onto something. And vichara is the ability to keep it there for a long time. So the reference to striking a bell, hitting the bell is vitaka, the resounding of the bell is vichara. Okay, so if you can maintain this concentration, if you can keep your attention focused and fixed and still enough on one point, then you can get to access concentration. Okay, so I'm going to explain what access concentration is. So some experiences people have, or they see lights in the mind's eye, the breath starts to slow down almost to a stop. The body becomes spontaneously still and thoughts are gone. So the mind is focused on a continuous stream. So you can practice this. This is achievable. This is attainable. Absolutely. People talk about it being a very high. It's not. You just have to sit and focus on one point and do the work. And you can. And it just simply is keeping your mind focused on one point and stilling. Just stilling everything, not getting involved in the thoughts. So as soon as you start to think, you just reapply the mind to an object, if you're working with the breath, or a stone or a disc or whatever that object is. So yeah, these are very interesting signs. The body will stop. The breath will almost disappear. So one of the interviewees I spoke to, they were talking about entering into access concentration. First pre-jhana, this is a quote that they described. First pre-jhana, when the mind is in access concentration, the mind is quiet and the thoughts are in the background. Breath is gone to almost nothing. It's like the finest thread, and there is an urge to gulp, but you don't need to. And often there's a lights at this stage. So this person also said they deliberately restricted their breath, and that seemed to be a way in to access concentration. There's a famous jhana teacher, Lee Brassington, a Buddhist jhana teacher. He teaches this type of meditation. You can go on retreats with him, and yeah, he teaches you particularly jhana. Now there is discrepancy. Some Buddhist monks will say that isn't jhana. Jhana is much higher. You don't have concept of the flesh and everything. But anyway, right, that's another whole other debate. So methods, how do we get to access concentration? So there's preparatory grounds that we need to go through first, okay, before we are able to still the mind. If you have a very busy mind, if you have a mind with a lot of ill will, if you have impatience, lack of love for yourself and others, it's very difficult. It's very difficult because you need a light mind. You need wholesome dharmas arising for it to be still, steady, buoyant, and focused. So the problem is with samatha meditation, if you haven't prepared with a good moral practice and developing the immeasurables, we'll discuss what the immeasurables are, or the correct attitudes, you can strain the mind, it becomes tiring and you fall asleep. So we need a lightness, a buoyancy to make this work, to get to access concentration. This is the problem, I suppose, with a lot of maybe modern mindfulness movements. They don't include the shila, moral conduct, or the immeasurables. These are very, very, very important as a foundation before you meditate. There's so many articles on people going mad from meditation. It's because we need to develop shila and loving attitude towards the self and others. This is fundamental as a start to your practice. The mind will do all kinds of things unless you've got a really healthy ego to begin with. So, okay, the immeasurables, let's talk about that very briefly. Friendship, compassion, joy, equanimity. Okay, when you cultivate these, there's a release to the heart, the mind is lighter, you can concentrate for longer, it's easy, it's fun. So meditation shouldn't be a chore. When you develop the immeasurables, meditation becomes a joy. It's not boring, it's not something that strains the mind. When it becomes a chore, the mind will strain, it becomes tight, it becomes boring. You develop negative dharmas towards meditation. Now, so this is all really in detail in the Visuddhimagga, the Path of Purification by Buddha Gosha. This is what this is a big text that Theravadan Buddhists analyze and look at. This goes into real psychology, a psychological analysis of what particular practices would be beneficial to certain minds. Now, we all have different hindrances. Maybe I'll go to this one. We all have different hindrances. Some people more sensory desire or ill will or sloth or restlessness and worry. So there are different practices for different types of minds. And this is all in the Visuddhimagga. So ill will, you would cultivate metta bhavana first, you know, and even you might have had a lot of suffering in your life. You might have very damaged ego or sense of self. You might be have had a lot of pain, or, you know, so developing loving kindness towards the self is very important. This will lighten the mind, and then naturally metta will flow out of your heart towards others. Tiredness, if you're a very intellectual brain, you can crave stimulation a lot, and that can make you nod off, because meditation can get boring. There's no stimulation. So I don't know, a phone, don't use the phone, or try to study less, or just with the sun on your face, walking, exercise. This will wake you up, but physically, not mentally. Worry, develop gratitude, kind actions, mindfulness of breath, doubt. Study the scriptures, listen to teachers who you trust. Now, for me, teachers who I think it's really important to find teachers with a good moral. If you hear of dramas around teachers, I don't know, like the foundations are important, I think. But that's another discussion. Okay, so when you practice loving kindness, this is something extraordinary happens. It's a really good, I think you can enter into jhana with loving kindness. You can enter into access concentration if you use loving kindness as an object. There's a real lightness to the mind that happens, and a buoyancy of the heart, and a real clarity in your meditation. It's very easy to keep the mind fixed and focused on one point. So starting with metta bhavana meditation and then going into samatha is very useful. It can also, if you have a very deep, profound spiritual experience and you've done a lot of metta bhavana and love for the self, it's okay to let go. Sometimes it scares the shit out of people when when they see death or deathlessness. It can bring someone into nihilistic tendencies. So metta bhavana is very good for how do you say, taking off with wings as opposed to falling into the abyss. And I think that's a really important way to view this. We don't know what the mind does that in these very deep states. That's why we prepare with very wholesome dharmas to support you, protect you on the path. Okay, so the Eightfold Noble Path, we won't go into that because I'm aware of the time, right? So the jhanas. After access concentration, we enter into the jhanas. Now, the jhanas are extraordinary. They're very ecstatic. So you enter into a state of bliss. Some people describe shaking or rapture, ecstasy, flooding the body. And this is, so they put people in CAT scans who are easily able to get into the jhana, and they were able to see dopamine flood the brain, absolutely flood the brain. So people were raptured, absolutely raptured. Now, you can't really meditate when you're in this state. But the root of jhana is jayati, to burn up. And this could be equated to kundalini experiences. I mean, they didn't have kundalini back then. However, they did describe certain experiences. And their first 4 jhanas, they are very physical. The rupa jhanas, the very physical jhanas, they've experienced them in the body. As you move through the jhanas, they become more and more subtle. Okay, so first is some people are actually bouncing around the room in the first jhana. It's so rapturous and ecstatic, but gross, like physically gross, like you can't really concentrate. You can't see the nature of reality. So what you do is you let go of attachment to joy or ecstasy or bliss. And then you move into the second jhana. So it becomes more and more subtle as you move through the jhanas until you get to the 4th jhana. I won't discuss the arupa jhanas, the later jhanas. However, the Buddha is said to have mastered all 8. to be a Buddha. I have read about arahants, people becoming arahants by only, actually having good insight even without jhanas. But the fourth jhana, that's the important point here. So moving through these jhanas, it becomes more and more subtle in the body. When we get to the fourth jhana, there's no more piti or rapture, bliss. It's just solid. Your body is solid, the mind is solid. It's immovable equanimity. Nothing is going to budge you. Nothing is going to move you out of this equanimity. And this is a real experience, really sat in it. So talking to certain meditators, they described this like being like a rock sunk to the bottom of the ocean. There's nothing going on here. There's no thoughts, no emotions, really solid. This is when you start to pierce the nature of reality. This is where your insight gets very deep and you can see the dharmas arising. You can see the ego forming and falling apart. You can see the way the mind works. You can see how the dharmas interact with each other. You can feel the bubbles arising and passing away. You can experience the mahabhutas down to an elemental level. You can experience their vibration and how they interact with each other. So this is what people do when they're very deep in vipassana, and the fourth jhana will allow you to get there. Now, this is vipassana. This is really to get the insight that vipassana is after, then we need the jhanas. But the Goenka, this is Burmese. There's a whole bunch of interesting history which happened in Burma. They just focused on insight. Because the British went to Burma, they took away their king and queen who were supporting all the monasteries. The monasteries all fell apart, and so they formed smaller groups of practitioners which only focused on the direct means to enlightenment, which was insight. And so they left jhana out. So Burmese focus on vipassana. However, to really get, I know people who practice meditation, when they practice samatha, vipassana got really strong. So I don't know. There's different ways in. So vipassana. This is when we start to watch the nature of reality. This is all written in the Satipatthana Sutta and the Samanapala Sutta. I'm aware that I'm really running out of time here, but do stop me if we're really going over the time. So why do we practice vipassana? We want to see the nature of the rise and fall of the dharmas. Okay, we want to see how ignorance forms. We want to see how the dependent originating thoughts. We want to see causality happening. When we do this, the mind changes. The mind changes forever. We are no longer interested in samsara anymore, because we see it as just this endless thing. Another really interesting thing that happens in the fourth jhana is people talk about seeing past lives, future lives, seeing other people's past lives and future lives. Now, I think in the East, Siddhi is a little bit more normal than in the West. We kind of freak out about Siddhi. It's okay. Siddhi is only a hindrance if we get attached to them. Later Buddhists hold Siddhi very high. Siddhi is in mental powers as a high regard because it helps with the transmission of Dharma. So the guru-student relationship really does happen because of Siddhi. You know, the teacher can transfer Dharma onto another person through insight, through a direct mind-to-mind transmission. Okay, and this is done through Siddhi. You develop these in the fourth jhana. So that's a great thing. You know, if you're using it for spreading Dharma, that's a wonderful thing and something to be, honoured and practiced potentially for the right reasons. Okay. So Vipassana, why do we practice Vipassana? Yes, Namarupa. Okay, so now we're in Vipassana. This is what we become mindful of. Now I know, so all you Vajrasatins, this is on your test, I think. The 4 foundations of mindfulness. This is what we are watching, arising and passing away. So what we're watching is the same for every human being. This is a universal thing for a human, okay? The things that are arising and the things that are passing away. So the first contemplation of the body, you're watching the posture, you're aware of what your posture is doing all the time, you're mindful with clear comprehension, what it's doing, every movement. Also, reflection of the repulsiveness of the body. This helps with too much sensual desire. You think about the hair follicles, the pus, the bile, the blood, the sweat, break the body down. This is what the monks do. They break it down into each component, and then you stop being so attached to pain and pleasure in the body. If you get ill, it doesn't freak you out. It's like, this is your meat suit. You know, a friend of mine, he was a Sri Lankan monk, and he used to practice this quite intensely, and he would say that he became his body would sweat, and he wouldn't feel gross, or he wouldn't have this kind of reaction to what his body did anymore. It was just his body. So it's a really interesting outcome. This helps with going deeper into meditation. A reflection of the elements, the material, the Mahabhutas, and then the 9 cemetery contemplations. So thinking, there's lots of different meditations on death, corpses rotting, things like that. Sounds very morbid, but this is what happens to all of us. This is life. This is okay. You know, we have to get over it, and helps us release the attachment to life. Yeah, so the next one, contemplation of feeling, pleasant feeling, unpleasant feeling, and neutral feelings. So just watching them. Oh, that's a pleasant feeling. Oh, that's an unpleasant feeling. So, oh, that's nothing. So you're just watching them arise and noting them. Third is contemplation of consciousness. What is the mental state that is arising? The nature of the thought. Is it hate, love, ill will, things like that? Fourth, contemplation of mental objects. So thinking about or observing the hindrances, the 5 aggregates of clinging. So that would be, hang on, let's go back. The 6 internal sense bases, 7 factors of enlightenment, 4 noble truths. So 5 hindrances. We've discussed the 5 hindrances before. Ill will, doubt, sloth. The 5 aggregates would be like sensations, perceptions, mental activity. So that would be samskaras, and consciousness, so the nature of the mind. The 6 internal sense bases, so that's like, just notice what your ear is doing. How does your ear function? How does it listen? What's the point at which the sound stimulus meets the ear? What happens there? So you're really paying attention to how the senses interact with the outside world. And then the 7 factors of awakening. So this is all in contemplation of mind objects. So you're contemplating mindfulness, energy, joy, rapture, relaxation, concentration, and equanimity. So we're really developing this, or noticing these. You need these 7 factors to really get deep samatha practice and deep vipassana practice. Okay. Equanimity. So the siddhis, we talked about that, getting insight, the 3 characteristics. So again, we're trying to get to impermanence, seeing impermanence, seeing how suffering happens. So through the 4 foundations of mindfulness, you're developing real deep insight into the nature of the mind. So those 4 foundations of mindfulness are doorways, gateways into seeing the dharmas arising and passing away. When you meditate on those particular types of meditations in the 4 foundations of mindfulness, if you really set in, you know, your samatha, your concentration is strong, and you're watching these things arise and pass away, you'll go deeper and deeper into that until you see them as dharmas arising and passing away. That's the transformation that we want to happen in the mind. Okay, so now just a summary. The Buddhist enlightenment, removing the hindrances, calm concentration, seeing dharmas to extinguish aversion and craving. And we get there through samatha and vipassana. Okay, so phew. Right, are we all good so far? Right. Okay, so now we're going to talk about Pātañjalayogaśāstra, or the Yoga Sūtras of Patanjali. Now, it's referred to the Pātañjalayogaśāstra when we talk about the Yoga Sutras with the commentary. Some scholars think the commentary comes or was written by the same guy who wrote the sutras. So when we think like that, we refer to it as Pātañjalayogaśāstra. If we think that they're separate, the commentaries, then we refer to them as the Yoga Sūtras of Pātañjalayogaśāstra. I don't know why, it's just what some scholars have decided. Now, we're going to look at the similarities of these practices, and how and why certain things are interrelated. Or we're just going to focus on the things, why certain practices work. Okay, so the four padas, the four books, we're going to really focus on sadhana, the sadhana pada, the practice, and look at the different types of yoga. So to yoke. So here's a picture of a cart, horse and cart. This is the one of the many meanings of yoga, to yoke the senses. So different types of yoga will use a different meaning to it. So you've got all kinds of different yogas throughout the 2000 years of the development of yoga. The meaning will change based on the intention, the outcome, and what it is that that practice is focusing on. So this yoga is to yoke the senses. So to join the senses together, to control them, just like that man is doing with his horse and cart, controlling the ox. And the animal is wild. The senses are wild. We are restraining them. We're focusing them. We're keeping them steady so we can enter into deeper stages of meditation. Okay, so the types of yoga that apply to the Yoga Sutras would be the root yuj, yoke, to join the senses. Samkhya, this is the philosophy we just discussed, the yoga philosophy. Samadhi, so this is a type of samatha, concentration, one-pointed focus concentration. Tapas, generating discipline, heat, energy. Siddhi, yogic power, the same as we saw, similar, bit different, but from the same place, actually. We'll talk about that in more detail, as the Idi, Pali Idi, in the early Buddhist doctrines. Raja Yoga, kingly yoga. So this is interesting. Raja Yoga is originally referred to the kings, didn't have time to do all the tapas, so they would just sit and meditate. It's not necessarily a type of yoga that stands alone. It was just kind of beneficiary for the royalty at the time. So that's one story around it. And of course, yoga asana. Okay. So if we can think back to the gunas, the tamasic nature, the endless creation, the endless interaction of the gunas, the endless obsession, or not obsession, or just unfolding nature of the gunas, which continually makes samskaras. We become more ignorant, we become more tamasic, we stop to see. So through virtuous behavior and thought, a sattvic mind is created. Okay, book 3, verse 35. So a sattvic mind really sees the nature of reality. So a lot of the practices are about cultivating a sattvic mind so that you can really see the nature of reality. See that the interplay of the gunas. So jhana, or knowledge, is the key to liberation. Okay, so the classic chittavriti nirodha yoga is the restraint of mental modifications. So when we restrain these modifications, when we're able to still the mind enough, you're able to see how things really are and therefore become liberated. And this, the concept of pramana becomes a very important thing. Direct seeing, direct experience. So what are the practices? Okay, so book 2, there are 55 sutras in this. Sadhana, practice or discipline. So this is all about kriya, which leads to samadhi. So kriya is action. Initially, we take action. We can't just sit back and let it happen. We have to, the senses, the prakriti will keep going. So we need to intentionally stop this movement or interplay of prakriti. And this ignorance, which continually creates more samskaras. Okay, so I know you've probably heard this so many times before, haven't you? Especially if you're teacher trainers with Jim and Khadine. Okay, so the 8 limbs, Ashtanga Yoga, Yama, Niyama, Asana, Pranayama, Pratyahara, Dharana, Dhyana, and Samadhi. These are the stages of yoga, and what we're trying to do is clean up all the samskaras that we've accumulated over the years. And we want to start by being good. Start by creating this wholesome foundation with our yama, our codes of behavior. I won't go through all of these because I'm pretty sure that you've been through this loads before. So these are creating, much like in the Buddhist concept, wholesome dharmas. We're creating a sattvic mind. Okay, so these are their nature, the very nature of these thoughts are sattvic. And so they allow us to see through them. They are like a clear window, these behaviors, these attitudes, as opposed to the more negative types of behaviors. When they're very tamasic behaviors, we can't really see the nature of reality, okay? They're not as transparent. These are very transparent attitudes and behaviors. So we really try to create this as a foundation initially to stop creating more tamasic samskaras, okay? So this is the point of the codes of behavior. Again, niyama. So the first one would be codes of behavior to really kind of create a harmonious emotional and mental life. And then niyama, we're starting to move more towards the body. The body becomes a very important part at this stage. So rather than in Buddhism, we're not manipulating the body. Early Buddhism, later Buddhism we are. Early Buddhism, we're not manipulating or changing the body. We are just concentrating the mind and observing the nature of the dharmas. Yoga, however, we are starting to control the body. And we start by keeping it clean, doing practices. The food we eat, everything like that is going to affect the mind. So this is maybe how they're slightly different, although the Buddhist would have a particular diet as well. Okay, so I won't go into each of these. I'm aware of the time that we have. So this is quite similar to the 7 factors of awakening that we're cultivating in Buddhism: mindfulness, investigation, energy, joy, rapture, relaxation, tranquility, concentration, equanimity. You know, by cultivating these good attitudes. So initially we have to use a tremendous amount of will to turn these negative thoughts around. So in Sutra 2.33, we have to disrupt the flow of negative thought patterns. Okay, but the code of behavior becomes a very good place to start. I won't go into all the benefits of yama niyama, but there are some really extraordinary things that happen when you really perfect each yama and niyama. So for instance, when truthfulness, when you really when you nail it, when your words are light, pure, truthful, honest, the yogin has a power in the word. So whatever you say, it really affects people. So you can tell someone to stop smoking and they will, because of the power of your word. So this is a siddhi, I suppose, you can accumulate from really getting it bang on. So these can go to quite a high level, these yama niyama. Okay, so then we've got a behavior down, and now we want to move on to the asana. So the asana, so steady, comfortable posture, early yoga. The more dynamic postures haven't really started to circulate yet. This is much later on. So early postures, there are postures in the Vyasa, who commentates on the sutras, describes postures, which we'll talk about in a minute. But really, this is about creating a steady comfortableness in the body, easefulness, relaxed, meditative poise. So when you're in your asana, the dualities of life don't affect you. The craving and the aversion don't affect you. You're really steady in your physical being, you know. So we're taking away a very thick, heavy, gross layer of samskaras right there. So when you're not tense in your body, your mind is a lot more relaxed, and therefore you can meditate, you become more sattvic. Okay, so so we want to so yeah, let's have a look at some of these postures. Here's just an example. Now, okay, I haven't really studied these postures. I know you, Jim Khadine, you probably know a hell of a lot more about the early Vyasa postures than I do, but here's just they might have changed a lot. These are the modern ones. I don't know what they were like back then. So they do, Vyasa does describe some of these postures, and this is how they would be equated to today. So they're seated postures. A lot of the early yoga are seated postures to prepare the body for meditation, iron out any tension in the body. Okay. And so once you can sit easily steady in these postures, then we can now move to a more subtle practice. Okay, so we are continually, slowly, gradually cultivating a more sattvic being. Okay, starting with the behaviors, then the physical body, now to pranayama. So initially with pranayama, you're controlling the length of the in-breath and the out-breath, and then the kumbhaka, the holding. Initially, that's what you're doing. You're learning to do this easily without strain. And so practice according to place, time, and number, either be short or long. What that refers to is the length of the breath going in and out, counting the amount of time the breath goes in and out. And so place, I looked into this. I think it's referring to where you're holding the breath in your body. Maybe this is debatable. I don't know. Jim and Khadine, I reckon they could probably tell you a hell of a lot more about what this actually means, place. When pranayama develops further, it can become more subtle. So you're starting to notice the more subtle layers to the breath. And especially in cessation, so the space between inhalation and exhalation. This is Vyasa's commentary. This is what he goes into detail, a lot more detail with. So it's a little bit, he describes it like throwing water on hot stones. It just evaporates. So the breath just evaporates quickly. So when the mind is concentrated enough, the breath stops. So the breath is prana, breath is mind. These things are moving. That I suppose when your body's not shaking, when it's not tense, the prana moves more smoothly. It doesn't get stuck. When prana gets stuck, or when there's a stagnation, it's a bit like the mind getting hooked on one thing, and it will just keep creating more and more samskaras on top of that, on top of each other, and then you'll just get obsessed with one thing and then knot it up. So we're really just getting rid of all of the knots in the mind and the body, so that the prana can flow freely. Then we can start to focus on making the prana more subtle. Then the prana stops. So this is when you go into, much like in Buddhism, the access concentration, the prana slows down to such a point, the gunas stop interacting with each other and prakriti stops creating. This is how we go into dhyana. So here we have, so pranayama, so it says that this is a veil, so it makes the veil that covers enlightenment thinner. So we haven't got rid of it through pranayama, but it's a good start. We're now able to really make the mind subtle enough. So we can't destroy all of the gunas or prakriti with just yoga and pranayama. We need to go further. This is according to Vyasa. So the Vyasa describes this, Vyasa does a commentary on the Yoga Sūtras, describes the cessation of breath leading to absorption. Okay, absorption is in the, remember I described the access concentration where the breath stops before jhana. So this is real absorption. Sorry, my cat's walking over. Yeah. So pratyahara, once the breath is subtle, then we can go into dādhana. So pratyahara is like a, withdrawal, like a tortoise withdrawing its limbs. So prana is no longer flowing in the outer body, it goes more towards the inner body. And then you can really start to analyze the nature of the senses and the outside world. So you're starting to control your senses a lot more at this point. So this, there's a couple of points here with pratyahara. So we want to get rid of the attachment. So remember the senses, they have this kind of hunger for sensory objects. We want to get rid of this attachment to sensory objects. So in pratyahara, you really are just ending that relationship between the senses and their objects, which keep creating more and more samskaras. So we're really laya yoga, we're really withdrawing back through the evolutes, back up to mula prakriti. We're getting there. When you can withdraw the senses, then you start to get insight. Senses are deceiving. Once you detract the mind from the senses, an inner insight happens. So this moves on to dharana, fixing the mind on one specific point. So you can concentrate on, this is like samatha practice, fixing the point on a mantra, Om, Krishna, your devata, your devi that you're worshipping, your breath or a sacred image. And then that becomes dhyana, meditation. Okay, so they quite quickly move to dhyana, where the mind is like a continual flow towards the object that you're focused on. It doesn't move, it doesn't skit about, it's absolutely fixed on one object, much like access concentration. So it's fully absorbed on one object. Okay, there's a steady flow, so like an oil dripping constantly without separateness. So there is real deep stillness and tranquility. However, you are still separate from the object that you are meditating on. There's still you and there's still the object. That quickly moves on to samadhi, if we can steady the mind for long enough. Okay, so this is when you disappear and you become one with the object. You are the object that you're meditating on. There is no differentiation anymore. Now, the object takes complete possession of your mind now. There is no separate or self-cognition. So in some way, the seer doesn't exist anymore. It's completely wrapped up into itself and disappeared, or the evolutes have kind of dissolved back into each other. So it's just consciousness experiencing the object itself. There is no more you, self, or identity happening anymore. Now, this isn't Kaivalya yet. This is still a state of meditation. I won't go into Kaivalya. I think Samadhi's quite a good place to finish in terms of practice. Now, these, as you can see, these meditation states are really similar to samatha. The insight or the awareness of what it is in yoga that is going to release you from the suffering, release you from the continual, perpetual making of samskaras. So an interesting thing that happens when these two things, when all these 3 points come together, dharana, dhyana, and samadhi, when they all come together, it's called samyama. This is when everything, well, it's quite interesting. Siddhi, you can develop a lot of siddhi. Whatever it is you focus on cultivates different siddhi in the mind. Feel free to unmute. I'm going to leave it there because it really just can go on and yeah, I don't want to lose everyone too much.